Thank you. I think I sound
Can you
yep.
in the back?
Right, I think this is echoing. Very good. Thank you very much. And yes, it's Brookline, not Brooklyn, so make sure that we got the area where they have
That was
town.
home language. That was my home language.
That's all right. Brooklyn would have been a bit big for me, but Brookline was okay. Thank you very much for the invitation to talk. I've divided up my talk into 4 major points, and will be happy, of course, to address any other issues or points during Q&A. First will be what's been in Massachusetts classes for the past 15 years, and I will concentrate mainly on the English language arts because that's my area of expertise. I will just talk a little bit about the math standards that were created for Massachusetts and Common Core math standards as well. Then I'm going to talk about the results of what we've had in the state of Massachusetts for about 15 years, mainly as a result of the Ed Reform Act, which came out in 93, 94. I'll then talk about what Common Core may look like in the English language arts class, what you should look for as it's being implemented, and then some suggestions about what parents or school committee people might want to do based upon whatever their concerns or interests might be. Let me begin with what's been in the Massachusetts English language arts classroom for the past 15 years. Remember that in K through 6, we're talking about, for the most part, a self-contained elementary school classroom. And in the secondary grades, we begin with middle schools. There aren't too many junior high schools left in this state. And you probably have an English class, a dedicated English class, as in other subjects, that meets 4 to 5 times a week. And in your high schools, you probably have the same English class that meets 4 or 5 times a week. It's very different structurally from the elementary grades, and this is important to keep in mind because this distinction does not show up at all in Common Core's standards. And the document that has governed, for the most part, in Massachusetts, what elementary and then secondary English teachers did is the curriculum framework. Came from the department with a green cover, but of course downloaded without any color at all. And it contains the standards that were worked out by groups of teachers at different grade levels, and also by a group of different people together to put it all in some coherent fashion. And the people who did this both in 96, which was when the first version came out, and that was when the increases began to take hold, and then in 2001, when a more refined version of that original version came out, we had a few superintendents, a few principals, teachers at different grade levels, all of whom were on the major committee putting together all of this. I was in charge of all of it, but I was not writing all the standards. I was simply the editor. So I want that to be clear, that the people who wrote these standards were people from Massachusetts, and they were all English majors, including the superintendent. It's hard to find one who had been an English major, but David Roach from Millbury had been an English major, and he was on the committee. So it is possible to find people who know something about literature and who had been English majors and knew basically what they were talking about. So you had a homegrown set of standards for Massachusetts that made sense according to the people on the committee, and then because we had a public comment period as usual, that was part of the procedures that had to be followed. English teachers were asked how they liked some of the key features of the document, which included a recommended author list for the most part, and 2/3 of our ornery English teachers in this state said they liked having a recommended author list. This was important for MCAS because the assessment committees used these author lists as well as the groups of teachers that were on the different grade levels for the MCAS test, used these author lists to narrow the selections down to what was there in black and white that English teachers and others had approved of and could give at least some commonality to the level, the reading level, the difficulty level, the grade level of the passages that were being used. I say all this because you have almost none of that for Common Core. Totally different process, and you do not have that kind of input from the state of Massachusetts and its own teachers. Now, let's talk about first, as I say, what's been in the classes for the past 15 years based on what came through in this document, as well as MCAS and in related reforms that bounced off of this particular set of standards. Those would be teacher licensing tests, teacher licensing regulations, as well as professional development. I was sort of the master controller, and I was coordinating all the planes taking off to make sure that every document had the same kinds of standards embedded in it. That was my job. One of the major thrusts or focuses of the standards was literary study, which is, as you may know if you're following all of the comments being made about Common Core, literary study was at the heart of this document. Literature is the content of the English Language Arts class, not informational text, but literary text. That has always been the content of the English class at secondary level. So that was what was the focus, as English teachers wanted it to be, because this was also, as I say, their choice. We also had something that was taking place in grades K through 8, a distinction between expository or informational reading and literary reading. From K to 8, this was built into this document, but no percentages. We did not in any way presume to dictate what percentage of whatever a teacher taught should be one or the other. There were some content standards at the high school level that were very clear. Let me give you an example of what I mean by a content standard. This was one that was about myth, traditional narrative, and classical literature, and it was for grades 9 and 10. And if you go to look at examples of released items on MCAS, you will see passages that indeed reflect this particular standard. It said, analyze the character, structure, and themes of classical Greek drama and epic poetry. So you would find examples from the Odyssey, the Iliad, or a Greek tragedy or a Greek comedy, something that fit that standard at grade 9 or 10. There was also, from this document, an emphasis on the major genres or kinds of literary works that English teachers have always taught. Poetry, drama, fiction, and nonfiction. There was always nonfiction there. It was not called informational text because that's something that you read, generally speaking, in a history class, in a science class, in maybe mathematics possibly, but you do read nonfiction, biography, autobiography, some speeches, some essays in the high school English class. We also made sure there were dictionary skills taught and that there was a strong vocabulary strand and an emphasis on the research process. And that is not there either. Now, what were the results? Very quickly, because I want to make sure we have a lot of time. And could someone, Donna, perhaps you give me a signal when, I've used up about 15 out of the 20 minutes you suggested, so you just let me know. What happened is that by 2005, which means less than 10 years working with basically the same orientation, the same kind of document, Massachusetts kids were #1 on the, what is called the report, the National Report Card, NAEP, National Assessment of Educational Progress, NAEP, in grade 4 and grade 8 on reading. We were also #1 in mathematics as well. But we were #1 starting in 2005, and at every time NAEP tests have been given, we were at the head of the line. This was because teachers were teaching to what they thought were clear standards, high standards, and MCAS was based very clearly on them with teacher-developed test items. And they knew what these test items were because they were released every year. You may not remember that unless you were connected to the schools, but by law, the test items, the core that was used every year, had to be released publicly. This is not happening with Common Core either, by the way. Very serious issue, because everyone in Massachusetts could see what their kids were being tested on. And in math, believe me, you had people poring over those problems to see if they could find a problem and get the example taken out, because they wanted to be sure that it wasn't going to trick particularly the more able kids who would be stumped and spend their time trying to figure out what the trick was. That's usually who ends up being tricked when you have a tricky item on a test. In any event, we were tops on NAEP. TIMS came along, which is the Trend in International Mathematics and Science Survey, an international test. Massachusetts entered as a country. I think this was in 07, 08. I'm not sure what year the test actually took place. It was reported a year or two later. But we entered as a country and came out for grade 8, tied for first place in science. This was on math and science, and we were among the top in math. So we were certainly internationally competitive, just looking at Massachusetts as a country for its own kids who were tested. We also kept improving in terms of the number of students taking AP courses, and in terms of SAT scores, which kept on increasing. And we also turned out to have another prize that we weren't really paying much attention to at the time, didn't know much about. Our Voc Tech kids were doing beautifully on MCAS. From the very beginning, you may not remember that, but when the first MCAS tests were given in 1998, almost all the classes at our Voc Tech schools taking those tests flunked, and they asked to be exempt. The Board of Education, and we have a member who is here, who was on the Board of Education, the commissioner and others all said, no, we're not going to exempt our Voc Tech schools. They're going to take the same tests that the kids take for these two subjects, English and math, in high school. And the Voc Tech schools bit the bullet, and lo and behold, the kids' scores began to rise. And now almost all of them pass the English test. Much higher numbers pass the math test than the average in the regular public schools, and they are indeed something for the state to be very proud of, the 25 to 30 vocational technical schools. So you have a lot to be very proud of in this state because of the way all of these different pieces were coordinated. Now, what will Common Core do in the English language class, given what this document did? Well, there are a number of issues that have been raised. We really don't know yet what the results are going to be because there have been no tests based on Common Core anywhere. So this is all hypothetical. All we know is the kinds of arguments and criticisms that have come up. First of all, the chief architect of Common Core's English Language Arts Standards, who had never taught at all in K-12 and has never done anything recognizable in literary scholarship, he has no background credentials, divided all the K-12 reading standards into two groups, one called informational and the other called literary. And English teachers, it was implied, were to divide reading instruction 50% literary, 50% informational or nonfiction. 50%. Now, this is in no way something that at the high school level allows English teachers to concentrate on literature, which is the other claim he makes out with a forked tongue, obviously. If it's 50-50, there's no way you can say that literature is being emphasized or stressed. Nor is it clear what kind of information is coming into the English class, as teachers all across the country now take out some of the literature they taught in order to make room for something called informational text, for which there is no research to suggest that it will improve college readiness. I know that because I'm a reading researcher by background training, and I've called up reading researchers, and of course they know there's no research to even back up that claim. Where did critical thinking come from? Generally speaking, it came from studying classical literature. So we have removal of the very kind of complex literature, particularly older literature with hard vocabulary and difficult sentence structure, that used to develop the kind of critical thinking that one could get from learning how to read between the lines of complex, difficult texts. Texts that had peculiar language difficulties, hard vocabulary. You look at the vocabulary of 18th, 19th, early 20th century novels, and they are far more difficult than the contemporary works that many kids read today in high school, even in grades 11 and 12. So you will have, even though there is supposed to be an increase in the reading level, by high school you will have fewer literary works taught under Common Core if teachers and superintendents follow the 50-50 divide. You will also have no research process. I think this is off now.
I can check. You might have pressed the,
Did I press something?
maybe press the mute. No,
Oh.
see?
In any event, I can use my grandmother voice to speak louder. Let me just say that you also have no stress on the process, research process. I don't hear it ever. Okay. Which means that kids are going to be doing a lot of what is called research, but it's really not the research process that they're learning how to use open-ended questions to guide the development of the kind of research that they should be learning how to do when they're in school, so that you can be an independent citizen, as I was in town meeting, and be able to do your own evaluation of the information you get at town meeting because you know how to do your own research. That has always been one of the basic requirements for independent citizenship, being able to do your own research, knowing how to look up information, knowing how to read between the lines of whoever's giving you a story about something, whether it's trash removal or garbage pickup or whatever it is, you need to know how to read between the lines. And being in a very typical town meeting, one of the hottest topics every year was snow removal and garbage pickup. It doesn't matter where you live, it's always the same important topic, whatever affects your daily life. And you have to know how to read contracts and legal materials adequately to know how to vote at town meeting, because bylaws, warrant articles have to be written at a level so that they are accessible to the average citizen. That's known as self-government. And you can't have self-government if the only people who can read your warrant articles are just a few people, like lawyers in the audience we discovered when we had rent control issues in Brookline. No one could read any of the articles except a few lawyers in the audience. So you have to make citizenship ultimately the final word on what you're doing. Now, what else will you see in a Common Core classroom? You're not going to find much stress on content knowledge, on literary historical knowledge, because it isn't being asked for. This is what English professors have noticed. You're also not going to have strong vocabulary lessons as we had in the Massachusetts document. You will not find a very consistent and understandable grammar section. I have looked carefully at the teaching of grammar, which is required, and it would take a linguist to understand what some of the terminology means. I was in Arkansas for 5 years talking to elementary teachers there. They had no idea what the indicative mood is. I don't know how many people here know what the indicative mood is, never mind the subjunctive mood, but this is not exactly the stuff that's friendly to teachers. So you have peculiar writing assignments also, and I don't have time to go into details for them, where students need to make claims starting in grade 5 or 6. Claims about what, we're not sure. They're reading stories, but we don't know because the writing and reading standards aren't coordinated. And they have to give evidence, which we also asked for in our document, from the text. But what a claim is to a 5th grader or 6th grader, I've said very facetiously to people that I'm sure if you asked most kids what a claim is, they think about a baggage claim, and that would be about as far as they could get with a claim for an essay. So we have problems with what's going to be in a classroom where basically, and I'm making a claim here that I can't go into myself, you're having a set of standards that have reduced the academic level by about 2 grades worth. In mathematics, this is clearer because mathematicians look at the topics and they can see by the topics that what kids are studying by, say, grade 8, 9, or 10 might be 2 grades lower. It's not as easy in English to point that out, but it's easier to make that claim, as I say, for math. So we have a number of problems. Yet we have, and here I'll just quickly go through some of the issues which were raised in a recent newspaper article by the Commissioner of Education, who claimed that we had all kinds of crosswalks, comparisons, that told us that the standards we adopted, Common Core, were as good as, if not better than, the ones we had. Well, first of all, the ones that we've adopted, and I was on the State Board of Education until that month of the vote, July 2010, they're not internationally benchmarked, they're not research-based, and they don't make us competitive with high-achieving Asian countries. That was supposed to be the basic premise of any set of, quotes, national standards. Nor did your own State Board of Education ask for higher ed faculty who teach freshman math and English to give an evaluation of the college readiness level of Common Core's high school standards. That was something I kept asking for. Who else knows better than those who teach freshman math and freshman English in our own state colleges and universities, public and private, what kids should come in to be college ready? Governor didn't ask, State Board didn't ask, legislators didn't ask. It still can be done. Have higher ed faculty tell us what they expect for an incoming freshman. Why didn't the crosswalks work very well? I also explained why they were very uninformative, because they didn't look at the overall organization of the standards, they just looked at a match between the way one was written and another was written, but it doesn't look at the entire organization. So you had very poor evaluations done by people who were being paid, literally, by the Gates Foundation to come in with a judgment that said, if Massachusetts got rid of its own standards, it would be moving ahead. It wasn't true, but they paid 3 different groups to come up with about the same judgment and conclusion. Finally, I'm going to ask people to think about this problem of closing demographic gaps, because a lot of this is being driven by demographic gaps. I'm going to finish up in about 1 minute. Where do we account in Common Core standards for such differences as student motivation, family support and structure? It doesn't address it at all. So how can we expect equal achievement by all groups when we have huge differences across individuals, often within the same family? That's why we've always been able to work out some form of individualized instruction to accommodate the differences that naturally and normally take place among groups, within families, and there is nothing in Common Core standards that holds parents or kids accountable. Only teachers are. Very peculiar, as if teachers were the only source of influence on kids in K to 12. Very unfair, and I have been a classroom teacher. Okay, I'm through now.